Harlem, in the late 1980s, was a place of contrast, a neighborhood alive with music, fashion, laughter spilling from brownstone steps, and yet shadowed by the weight of a drug epidemic that was transforming every street corner into a marketplace of survival. In the middle of this world walked a young man whose name would soon echo far beyond those crowded avenues. Alpo Martinez was not just another hustler trying to make ends meet, he was a figure who seemed to embody both the hope of escape and the inevitability of downfall. For those who saw him drive past in polished cars, windows tinted, gold chains catching the light, he was more than a hustler, he was the vision of Harlem's possibility, wrapped in danger and charisma. For others, particularly the mothers who saw their children pulled toward his lifestyle, he was a warning, a shadow cast too long over a community already hurting. To fall asleep to a story like Alpo's is to enter a dream that begins with ambition. You can almost hear the hum of the city at night, taxis honking far off, music beating from open apartment windows, kids still playing long after curfew. Into this world came a boy who wanted to be more than ordinary, who looked at the men on corners with designer coats and overflowing pockets and thought, why not me? Harlem was his stage, and he would learn to play the role of a star until the spotlight turned too hot to bear. The fascination with Alpo Martinez lies not only in his rise but in the contradictions that defined him. He was, at once, loved and hated, admired and despised, a man who could win over a crowd with a smile and just as quickly lose their trust with a single decision. Harlem's children wanted to be him, Harlem's parents wanted to keep their sons far away from his example. He was the kind of figure who makes legends feel alive, dangerous, complicated, magnetic. As we begin this journey into his life, imagine the restless energy of a city that never sleeps. The neon glow on 125th Street, the smell of food carts, the sound of footsteps against pavement. Harlem was more than a backdrop, it was a living, breathing character in his story. It offered opportunity to those willing to risk everything and punishment to those who underestimated its unforgiving nature. For Alpo, Harlem was both cradle and grave, the place that made him and, years later, the place that would take him back. The story of Alpo Martinez is not a simple one of rise and fall, it is a reflection of the streets themselves, where success comes quickly, and loyalty is often tested under the weight of greed and survival. His legend has been told in films, whispered in street corners, and remembered in courtrooms, but here, in the calm quiet of night, it unfolds with more patience. This is not the rush of a headline, not the sensational echo of tabloids. It is the slow unraveling of a life that was as complex as the city that raised him. What makes his story so powerful is that it holds within it so many contrasts. He was a hustler who wanted glory but found tragedy. A man who once commanded loyalty yet later betrayed those closest to him. A figure who seemed invincible until the night bullets found him in the same streets that once celebrated his rise. It is these contradictions that turn his biography into more than just history, it becomes a cautionary tale, a meditation on the cost of ambition without restraint. As you settle into the rhythm of this narrative, you will notice the ebb and flow of tension. There are moments where the energy rises, crowded clubs, roaring engines, whispered deals, and moments where silence becomes the loudest part of the story. In the quiet, in the pauses between events, we find the real Alpo, a boy who once dreamed of being something greater, a man who could not escape the consequences of the choices he made. This introduction is not about answering every question, but about opening the door to curiosity. Who was Alpo before the cars and the chains? What forces shaped him into the man he became? How did friendship turn into betrayal, and why does his story still matter decades after his name first hit the headlines? These are questions we will explore, layer by layer, as we walk with him through the corners of Harlem and the avenues of Washington, through prison cells and finally back to the streets where his life ended. For now, picture him as Harlem once saw him, a young man with an easy smile, stepping out of a car that caught every eye, the kind of presence that pulled attention without needing to demand it. Behind that smile was ambition, behind that ambition was hunger, and behind that hunger was the shadow of an ending he could not escape. His is the story of a hustler who believed he could master the game, only to discover that no one ever truly wins in the end. And so, as this tale unfolds, let the rhythm of the city guide you. Let the calm narration soften the edges of a story filled with violence, betrayal, and fleeting glory. Drift slowly into a world where ambition shines like neon and danger hides in every corner. This is the story of Alpo Martinez, the Harlem hustler who lived fast, played hard, and paid the ultimate price. East Harlem in the 1960s and 70s was a neighborhood caught between hope and hardship. It was a place where families leaned on one another, where neighbors watched children from stoops, and where music spilled out of radios in open windows. Yet behind that sense of community was an undeniable struggle, poverty that pressed against every wall, limited opportunities, and the creeping presence of drugs that were beginning to poison the city's lifeblood. Into this world, Alpo Martinez was born in 1966, a boy who would one day be known far beyond his block, though at that moment he was just another child in a crowded apartment, part of a family doing their best to make ends meet. Alpo's childhood was not one of privilege. He grew up in a working-class household, raised primarily by his mother, who tried to instill in him the values of hard work and discipline. The absence of a strong father figure left a gap that the streets of Harlem were all too eager to fill. Like many boys his age, he looked to the older kids on the block for guidance and inspiration. They weren't doctors, lawyers, or teachers. They were hustlers, men whose sharp clothes, sparkling jewelry, and stacks of money seemed like proof that the American dream could be reached right there on the pavement. Imagine the young Alpo standing on the corner, eyes wide as he watched men twice his age glide past in Cadillacs. These were the men who commanded respect, who seemed untouchable in a neighborhood where everyone else was just trying to survive. The streets became his classroom, and the hustlers were his teachers. His mother may have tried to guide him toward school and stability, but the lessons of the block burned brighter and faster in his young mind. Respect was not earned through patience or study, it was taken, displayed in material success, and defended with fear. Yet, it would be unfair to imagine Alpo as a boy destined for crime from the start. He was described as charismatic, with a natural charm that made people gravitate toward him. Teachers noticed his wit, neighbors remembered his smile. There was potential in him to walk a different path, but Harlem was not an easy place for a young man to find direction. Poverty is a teacher too, and its lessons are often unforgiving. For a boy like Alpo, whose ambitions grew quicker than his opportunities, the allure of fast money became almost impossible to resist. The East Harlem of Alpo's youth was in transition. Factories and stable jobs that once supported families were disappearing, replaced by uncertainty. Drugs were not yet at their peak devastation, but their shadow was growing. Families worked long hours just to keep food on the table, and children often grew up with little supervision. The corners became playgrounds, but also recruiting grounds. For Alpo, those corners held more than games, they held the promise of transformation. To him, hustling didn't look like crime, it looked like escape. He was still a boy when he first began running errands for older hustlers. Small tasks, harmless enough on the surface, but each one pulling him deeper into a lifestyle that seemed exciting and dangerous all at once. The money came quicker than he'd ever seen at home, and with it came respect from peers who once overlooked him. Slowly, a dual identity formed. At home, he was Alberto, the son trying to please his mother. On the streets, he was Alpo, a boy who already carried himself like he was destined for more. This tension between two worlds defined his early years. On one side, the warmth of family dinners, laughter with siblings, and his mother's hope that he might avoid the traps that had swallowed so many boys before him. On the other, the corners of Harlem at night, where lights glimmered off car hoods and men passed whispers about deals, danger, and money. Alpo moved between these worlds like someone balancing on a wire, too young to realize that one misstep could change everything. Every hustler's story begins with a first spark, a moment when the dream of fast money overpowers every other lesson. For Alpo, that spark came not from desperation alone, but from ambition. He wanted more than survival, he wanted recognition. To be known, respected, and feared in a city that so often ignored young men like him. Harlem, with its music, style, and restless energy, gave him a stage. The streets called, and Alpo was already leaning in to answer. As he grew into his teenage years, his identity began to solidify. The boy with charm and curiosity became the teenager with swagger and confidence. He was learning how to move in the world of hustlers, when to speak, when to stay silent, when to make a deal, when to show his temper. His education was not measured in grades, but in reputation. And reputation, in Harlem, was everything. Still, beneath the rising persona of Alpo the hustler, there was always the shadow of Alberto the son, the boy his mother prayed over, the child whose smile once carried innocence. That duality, the pull of family and the pull of the streets, would never leave him. It was the contradiction at the core of his life, loved at home, feared on the block, and always caught between the two. Looking back at Alpo's early years, one can see the inevitability forming, though in the moment it might have felt like simple choices, running an errand, pocketing a little cash, skipping a day of school. Each choice small, but together forming the foundation of a path that would lead to both glory and tragedy. The Harlem of his childhood gave him his first taste of the hustle, and once he tasted it, there was no turning back. The roots of Alpo Martinez were not simply in crime, they were in Harlem itself, in the culture, the struggles, and the temptations of a neighborhood that shaped him. He was a child of his environment, but also a child of ambition, unwilling to accept the quiet life of ordinary survival. In those crowded apartments and on those restless corners, a hustler was born. And soon, Harlem itself would feel the full force of his rise. The transition from boyhood curiosity to teenage ambition is often a quiet one, marked by subtle choices, but in Harlem during the early 1980s, it could happen almost overnight. For Alberto Alpo Martinez, those teenage years became the crucible where his identity as a hustler was forged. The wide-eyed boy who once admired the neighborhood's older hustlers from the sidewalk now began to walk among them, slowly learning the codes of the street. By the time he was in his mid-teens, Alpo wasn't simply watching the game, he was playing it, testing his skills on Harlem's restless corners. Imagine a block alive with sound, the thud of basketballs echoing from cracked courts, the bass of boom boxes rattling the air, the chatter of kids in clustered groups. Amid that background, there were other sounds, the low exchanges of hustlers moving product, the metallic jingling of jewelry, the quick laughter of men with money in their pockets. Alpo found himself drawn to that energy, to the fast rhythm of it. At first, his role was small, running errands, carrying packages, delivering messages. But even the smallest role in that world carried the intoxicating scent of money and power. For a teenager who had grown up without much, those first bills in his pocket felt like a transformation. Suddenly, he wasn't just another kid wearing hand-me-downs. He could buy sneakers, new jackets, little flashes of status that announced his arrival to peers who had overlooked him before. Respect began to come not from school grades or sports trophies, but from the confidence with which he now carried himself. Harlem had always rewarded image, and Alpo understood that better than most. His charisma set him apart. He wasn't the biggest or the toughest kid on the block, but he had a charm that made people listen. Older hustlers noticed his eagerness and his sharpness. He absorbed lessons quickly, when to trust, when to be cautious, how to read the flow of a corner. In Harlem, the streets were as much about psychology as muscle. You had to know when to smile, when to keep your eyes cold, and when to disappear before trouble arrived. Alpo was a quick study, and soon, he was more than just an errand boy. He was beginning to carve a name for himself, even if only in whispers. Still, the early hustle was not without risk. Police cruisers rolled slow through the neighborhoods, watching corners, harassing kids who looked too sharp for their age. Rival crews eyed one another with suspicion, ready to turn violence into currency if territory was threatened. Alpo was navigating a dangerous path, but to him, the thrill was part of the reward. Each successful move, each night that ended with more money than it began with, reinforced the feeling that this was the life he was meant to lead. At home, his mother still hoped for a different path. She urged him toward school, toward stability. But the pull of the streets was stronger than lectures. The classroom felt small compared to the wide-open energy of Harlem at night. Teachers' voices faded in memory, the roar of motorcycles, the flash of gold chains, the scent of expensive cologne in packed clubs, those became the soundtrack of his youth. By the time he was in his mid-teens, Alpo had built a reputation. Not yet the kingpin he would one day become, but a hustler in the making. He was smart enough to avoid unnecessary attention, but bold enough to make moves others his age wouldn't dare. Friends recall him as someone who could light up a room with his presence, but also someone who was already learning how to intimidate when necessary. That balance of charm and menace would become one of his trademarks. Every young hustler eventually reaches a crossroads. Some fade away, scared off by the risks. Others get caught early, their dreams of fast money ending in courtrooms and jail cells. And then there are the few who rise, who use ambition and instinct to climb higher than anyone expects. Alpo was on that path. Each small hustle was a stepping stone towards something bigger, though he may not have seen the full picture yet. What he did know was that he wanted more money, more respect, more recognition. The early 1980s in Harlem were a breeding ground for that kind of ambition. Crack cocaine was just beginning to change the landscape, and hustlers who positioned themselves correctly could amass fortunes seemingly overnight. Alpo was young, but he could sense the shift. He watched the older hustlers, studied their mistakes, and prepared himself to step into the game in a bigger way. There is a particular allure in those early hustling years, a feeling of invincibility that comes with youth and ambition. Alpo walked with a confidence that belied his age, his eyes already on horizons far beyond the block where he started. But within that confidence lurked a dangerous seed, the belief that he could outsmart anyone, that he could rise without consequence. It was a belief that propelled him forward, but it would also one day contribute to his fall. As the teenage Alpo moved deeper into the hustle, he began forming connections that would later define his life. His reputation as a charismatic, fearless young hustler caught the attention of older, more established figures. Doors that had once seemed closed began to open. What started as small-time hustling was evolving into something larger, something that would soon place him at the heart of Harlem's drug empire. But in these early years, the story was still one of beginnings. The glow of ambition was fresh, the excitement of fast money unspoiled by the betrayals and violence to come. He was a teenager in Harlem, stepping onto a stage that promised glory, danger, and tragedy in equal measure. His first taste of the hustle had become a hunger, and that hunger would not be satisfied with anything less than the top. And so, the boy who once looked at hustlers with admiration had become one himself. The transformation was underway. The streets had claimed him, and there was no turning back. The legend of Alpo Martinez was beginning, quietly at first, in the restless nights of Harlem's corners. But soon, his name would be spoken far beyond those streets, a name that carried both admiration and fear. Partnerships on the streets are rarely built on contracts or signatures, they're forged in trust, sealed in loyalty, and tested by the constant threat of betrayal. For young Alpo Martinez, still carving out his place in Harlem's hustle, the turning point came when he crossed paths with a man who already carried weight and reputation, Azie Faison. To Harlem, Azie, or Azie as he was known, wasn't just another hustler, he was a figure of discipline and quiet calculation. Where others flaunted recklessness, Azie balanced sharp business sense with a cautious approach. When Alpo met him, it was as if ambition had found its anchor, daring had found its strategist. Picture Harlem during the mid-1980s. The streets buzzed with opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. The drug trade was exploding, fueled by the devastating rise of crack cocaine. Young men who only months before were hanging on corners now drove luxury cars, wore designer fashions, and commanded respect far beyond their years. In this world, alliances mattered. One wrong move could turn a hustler into a target. One right connection could launch him into a new stratosphere of power. Alpo, still hungry and fearless, needed someone who could open doors beyond his reach. Azie Faison was that door. The two men could not have been more different on the surface. Azie was level-headed, known for keeping his cool even when situations turned hot. He approached hustling like a business, thinking long-term, calculating profits, managing risks. Alpo, by contrast, was charismatic and impulsive, a risk-taker who thrived on adrenaline. What might have made them clash instead became the source of their strength. Where Azie provided structure, Alpo brought boldness. Together, they were able to envision something larger than either could build alone. Their meeting wasn't just chance, it was Harlem's inevitability. A young hustler like Alpo was bound to be noticed if he moved with confidence, and Azie, already running a lucrative operation, was bound to take interest in talent that could be useful. Their first interactions carried the electricity of mutual recognition. Azie saw in Alpo the daring and hunger of someone who could push boundaries. Alpo saw in Azie the mentorship and stability he lacked. And so, step by step, they began to build a partnership. This was not a friendship built on innocence. The foundation was money, the mortar was ambition, and the blueprint was the empire they could construct together. Still, there was an undeniable sense of loyalty in those early days. Alpo admired Azie's intelligence, often looking to him for guidance. Azie, in turn, recognized Alpo's charm and fearlessness as tools that could help their operation expand. It was as if two puzzle pieces had fallen into place, completing a picture that Harlem had been waiting to see. The impact was immediate. With Azie's connections and structure, Alpo was able to step into a higher league of hustling. No longer was he just moving small amounts on the corner, he was now tied to a network that could bring in real money, the kind of money that changed not just an individual's life, but the landscape of entire neighborhoods. Cars, jewelry, stacks of bills, it all began to flow faster than ever before. And with it came a new level of recognition. Harlem began to take notice of Alpo in a way it hadn't before. He wasn't just the flashy teenager trying to prove himself. He was now part of something bigger, someone moving with the backing of an established hustler. The young boys on the block began to look at him with admiration, whispering his name as though it already belonged to legend. Women noticed his style, his confidence, the way he carried himself as though he had already made it. Alpo, always hungry for respect, was beginning to taste the kind of notoriety he had dreamed about. But with notoriety came pressure. Success in Harlem's drug trade was a double-edged sword. On one side, it offered wealth and admiration. On the other, it drew attention from rivals and police alike. The higher Alpo and Azie climbed, the more eyes fixed on them. Yet in those early years of partnership, it seemed as though nothing could slow them down. Their operation was smooth, their ambition matched, and their profits staggering. The synergy between them created a sense of invincibility. Together, they imagined a future where their names would dominate Harlem's narrative of hustlers. Every deal, every night spent plotting and planning, pushed them closer to that vision. They had become more than just hustler and mentor, they were partners chasing the same dream, though with very different methods. Still, beneath the surface of every partnership in the streets lies an unspoken truth: ambition eventually tests loyalty. Azie's cautious nature meant he valued long-term stability, while Alpo's hunger drove him toward bigger risks and faster moves. For now, these differences complemented each other. But even as their empire grew, the seeds of future tension were being planted. Ambition is never fully satisfied, and for Alpo, no level of success would ever feel like enough. The legend of their partnership would later inspire stories, books, and even films. People would look back on those days as the golden beginning, the moment when Harlem seemed to witness the birth of an unstoppable force. For now, though, it was just two men working side by side, plotting their next move under the city's neon glow. In the calm of late-night meetings, over stacks of bills and whispered strategies, Alpo and Azie were writing the first chapters of an empire. To the community, they were symbols of what ambition could achieve, proof that even boys from the blocks of Harlem could rise to unimaginable heights. To themselves, they were simply hustlers chasing the next opportunity. The partnership had begun, and with it, Alpo Martinez stepped onto a larger stage than he had ever known. The young hustler was no longer just a shadow on the corner, he was a rising star, and his light was about to burn brighter than ever. The partnership with Azie Faison had opened doors Alpo Martinez once thought impossible. For a boy who had started by hustling in the shadows, the transformation was staggering. Harlem, already buzzing with stories of money flowing faster than ever before, now whispered his name alongside the biggest players. Yet Harlem's streets, while full of opportunity, were also cramped by competition. For someone like Alpo, driven, restless, unwilling to remain confined, there was always the itch for more. The neighborhood had given him his first stage, but he was beginning to feel it was too small to contain his ambition. Harlem was a proving ground, but Washington, D.C., was a kingdom waiting to be claimed. Washington, D.C., in the 1980s was a city caught between politics and poverty, the power of Capitol Hill standing in stark contrast to the struggles of its streets. In the neighborhoods beyond the monuments and marble, the drug trade was erupting with unprecedented intensity. Crack cocaine had arrived like a storm, flooding blocks, devastating families, and turning corners into battlegrounds. Dealers who were clever enough, or ruthless enough, could make fortunes in weeks. But where there was money, there was blood. D.C. had earned its reputation as the murder capital, and anyone trying to stake a claim there needed more than just ambition. They needed fearlessness. They needed charisma. They needed someone like Alpo. For Alpo, the move to D.C. wasn't simply about chasing money. Harlem had given him recognition, but he craved dominance. In Harlem, he was one of several rising stars. In D.C., he saw the chance to become the centerpiece, to stand above the chaos as the undisputed figure controlling supply, distribution, and respect. The decision wasn't reckless, it was calculated in the way only someone obsessed with legacy could calculate. Alpo knew the streets of D.C. were brutal, but brutality was a language he was fluent in. The first time Alpo arrived in Washington, it was almost like stepping onto a different stage. The city's rhythm was distinct from Harlem's. The hustle was raw, less polished, and more violent. The dealers there carried themselves with a different energy, more aggressive, less trusting. To them, outsiders weren't welcomed, they were targets. But Alpo's charisma was his greatest weapon. Where others might have been viewed as intruders, he found ways to present himself as an ally, someone who could bring value, someone who could connect D.C. to Harlem supply lines. His confidence, his fashion, his ability to win people over, these became the tools that helped him slip into a city many others would have been swallowed by. Alpo began planting roots with precision. He didn't storm into D.C. with an army, he arrived with strategy. At first, it was about making connections, building trust, showing that he wasn't just another hustler trying to skim profits. He let his Harlem reputation precede him, but he also let his personality fill in the gaps. Slowly, he built relationships with key figures, men who already controlled sections of the city but saw in Alpo an opportunity to expand further. It wasn't long before his name began to circulate on D.C.'s streets, whispered in both admiration and caution. The money came fast, even faster than in Harlem. The demand in D.C. was insatiable. Blocks could be fed daily, and the cash stacked high. Alpo's charisma wasn't just for social gain, it was business strategy. He recruited fiercely loyal young men, many of them locals who were drawn to his style, his confidence, and the opportunities he provided. These young recruits became his eyes and ears, ensuring his operation could expand while maintaining a shield of protection around him. For Alpo, loyalty wasn't bought with promises, it was secured with opportunities for wealth and belonging. Yet Washington was not Harlem, and its dangers revealed themselves quickly. Rival crews watched Alpo's rise with suspicion. The police, already stretched thin by the crack epidemic, began to notice the surge in violence and money on certain blocks. Every move in D.C. carried greater risk than before. But Alpo thrived on risk. He didn't shy away from danger, he walked into it with his head high, as if daring the streets to challenge him. To his enemies, this confidence came across as arrogance. To his followers, it was the mark of a born leader. The more success he tasted, the more fearless he became. Nights in Washington blurred into mornings of plotting expansion, of finding ways to outmaneuver rivals, of stacking bills higher than ever. He wasn't just hustling anymore, he was constructing an empire brick by brick. The cars grew flashier, the jewelry heavier, the lifestyle louder. People noticed, and in noticing, they began to fear. And in the world of D.C. hustling, fear was currency more valuable than money. But beneath the shine of wealth and the echo of laughter in nightclubs, Alpo carried the weight of every decision. Expansion meant enemies. Money meant exposure. Fame meant danger. Washington rewarded ambition but punished recklessness. Alpo's greatest gift, his charisma and daring, was also the very thing that kept him walking the edge of destruction. Still, in those early D.C. years, the city felt like a canvas, and Alpo was the artist painting his vision across it. Every corner he touched, every crew he influenced, every dollar that flowed into his hands added to his legend. Harlem had given birth to his ambition, but D.C. was the stage on which he would perform his most audacious act. To the young hustlers watching him, Alpo was proof that fearlessness could rewrite destiny. To the city itself, he was both a rising king and a looming storm. As his empire grew, so too did the contradictions. Alpo was admired for his generosity, throwing money around, treating his people well, and living life at full throttle. But he was also feared for his ruthlessness. In Washington, generosity bought loyalty, but ruthlessness demanded respect. Together, they built the image of a man who seemed untouchable. Alpo wasn't just another hustler, he was becoming the embodiment of ambition itself. And so, the streets of D.C. whispered his name louder with each passing day. Harlem's prodigy had become Washington's power player. The move had paid off, and the legend of Alpo Martinez was growing too large to be ignored. What no one could yet see was that with every new victory, every new alliance, every new corner claimed, the seeds of inevitable conflict were also being planted. For now, though, Alpo was living his dream, fast, loud, and larger than life, as though the streets themselves belonged to him. The glow of Alpo's rise in Washington, D.C., carried a dangerous duality. On one hand, he was celebrated like a star, his name echoed in clubs, his cars caught stares on every avenue, and his reputation brought both admiration and awe. On the other hand, the very visibility that cemented his place as a kingpin also painted a target on his back. In the underground world of drug empires, notoriety was a double-edged sword. It attracted business and loyalty, but it also drew enemies, suspicion, and envy. The higher Alpo climbed, the sharper the blades around him became. Violence was not an anomaly in the crack-era streets of D.C., it was a constant hum in the background. Gunfire echoed like punctuation to the rhythm of the city, reminding everyone that ambition could cost lives. For Alpo, violence became both shield and sword. He had seen enough hustlers fall to know that kindness alone couldn't secure power. To hold territory in D.C., respect had to be enforced, and enforcement often meant blood. His charisma recruited allies, but his ruthlessness maintained order. Those who thought Alpo was all charm quickly learned the darker truth. Beneath the laughter and the gold chains lay a man willing to do whatever was necessary. As his empire expanded, so did the list of enemies. Rival crews resented his Harlem roots, accusing him of invading their city. Local hustlers saw him as competition, someone who was taking food off their plates. Each corner he claimed came at a price, and the payment was often violence. Shootings escalated, and whispers spread that Alpo wasn't just a businessman, he was a warlord shaping D.C. with fear. For those who worked under him, that fear worked in their favor. They felt untouchable, protected by the reputation of a leader whose name alone could clear blocks. But violence is never clean. Each act left ripples that stretched far beyond its intended target. Families grieved, police pressure intensified, and trust within Alpo's own circle became fragile. In a world where loyalty was currency, betrayal was always lurking, and paranoia began to creep into even Alpo's most secure moments. He was young, rich, and powerful, but the weight of constant threat hardened him. The laughter at clubs was still there, but behind it was the unspoken knowledge that any night could end in blood. One of the ways Alpo navigated this dangerous terrain was by balancing generosity with terror. On some days, he'd hand out wads of cash to young hustlers, buy gifts for friends, and throw parties that the city still remembers. On others, he would enforce brutal discipline on anyone who crossed him. This contrast became his signature. People loved him for his charm, but they respected him because they feared him. To Alpo, this duality wasn't a contradiction, it was survival. The streets demanded it, and he embodied it with precision. The violent reputation wasn't limited to street clashes with rivals. Even within his own operation, Alpo was quick to remind his crew that disloyalty would not be tolerated. He built an empire on trust, but that trust was held together by the knowledge that betrayal carried fatal consequences. Stories circulated, stories of men who had tested Alpo's patience, only to disappear. Whether every rumor was true or not didn't matter. In the streets, perception was reality, and the perception was clear: Alpo Martinez was not a man to cross. Yet, behind the iron mask of ruthlessness, Alpo's humanity flickered in moments of doubt. He wasn't oblivious to the destruction that trailed his name. He knew that every shooting, every feud, every violent order pushed him closer to the line between power and downfall. But power is intoxicating, and for someone who had risen so quickly, stepping back felt impossible. The fear he inspired became as addictive as the money he earned. Each act of violence wasn't just survival, it was affirmation that he controlled the streets, that no one could challenge him and live to tell the story. As the years passed, Washington became not only his kingdom but also his battlefield. Alpo moved with caution, yet always with style. He remained visible, flashing his wealth, showing the world he wasn't hiding. This visibility was strategic, an announcement that he feared no rival, no crew, no threat. But those who knew the game understood that this boldness came at a cost. In a city drowning in bloodshed, it was only a matter of time before Alpo's name was linked to crimes too large to ignore. Violence wasn't just a tool, it was becoming a defining trait of his legend. To the young hustlers watching him, Alpo was both hero and cautionary tale. He proved that fearlessness could rewrite the rules of the street, but he also showed that violence chained every man who wielded it. The very sword he used to cut his path forward was the same blade poised to turn against him. And still, in those tense years, Alpo's empire stood strong. The streets whispered his name with a mix of admiration and dread. To outsiders, he seemed invincible. To insiders, they saw the cracks forming, the paranoia, the rivalries escalating, the police circling closer. Every night was a gamble, every handshake a risk, every alliance temporary. Alpo was living larger than life, but in the world of hustlers and killers, living large often meant dying young. The story of Alpo's violent reputation is not one of random chaos but of calculated survival. He built his empire on both charm and brutality, ensuring that his name would be remembered not just as a hustler, but as a figure who shaped entire cities with fear and ambition. For a time, it worked. For a time, he seemed untouchable. But history teaches us that violence has a way of circling back, and Alpo's story was no exception. The same streets that crowned him king were already preparing the battlefield for his eventual reckoning. The higher Alpo Martinez climbed, the more he needed partners who could move with him at the same speed. In Harlem, his closest ally had been Azie Faison, the brains who managed money and logistics. But in Washington, where violence, ambition, and betrayal collided daily, Alpo needed someone who wasn't just smart with numbers, he needed someone who could match his appetite for risk. That someone came in the form of Wayne "Silk" Perry, a man whose name alone carried weight across the city. To many in D.C., Silk wasn't just a hustler, he was the embodiment of fear, loyalty, and violence rolled into one. Silk Perry was already a legend before Alpo crossed his path. He was tall, imposing, and carried himself with an aura that demanded respect. In Washington's underworld, where reputations could mean life or death, Perry's name rang out like a warning. He was known for his fearlessness, his willingness to handle problems directly, and his ability to inspire both fear and loyalty. For Alpo, a man expanding rapidly and facing enemies on all sides, Silk represented more than muscle. He was a shield, a sword, and an ally whose presence could transform an operation into something untouchable. The meeting of Alpo and Perry has often been described as inevitable, like two storms colliding to form something even more destructive. Alpo brought charisma, money, and connections to Harlem's pipelines. Perry brought intimidation, respect, and the kind of enforcement that silenced rivals. Together, they became a partnership that blurred the lines between business and legend. Alpo could focus on expansion, deals, and lifestyle, knowing that Silk's reputation alone kept enemies at bay. Perry, in turn, gained access to Harlem's flow of wealth and product through Alpo, elevating his own power in the process. Their dynamic was built on a kind of unspoken understanding. Alpo was the face of the operation, the smooth talker, the businessman in flashy cars, the man who could walk into a room and own it with charm. Perry was the enforcer, the shadow in the background, the one everyone knew could end problems with a look or a word. This balance worked seamlessly because each man played his role without stepping into the other's territory. Alpo respected Perry's ruthlessness, and Perry respected Alpo's ambition. In a world where betrayal was common, their mutual respect made their partnership stand apart. But what made this alliance so powerful also made it dangerous. With Perry by his side, Alpo's fearlessness grew into something larger, almost reckless. Rivals who once might have tried to test him now hesitated, knowing that challenging Alpo meant facing Perry's wrath. The combination created an aura of invincibility. Together, they projected an image of absolute control, Alpo smiling in the club, Perry watching from the corner, both men silently reminding everyone that their empire was not to be touched. For the people under them, the partnership was both inspiring and terrifying. On one hand, working for Alpo meant access to money, lifestyle, and prestige. On the other hand, Perry's presence reminded everyone that disloyalty was not just punished, it was erased. Stories circulated of what happened to those who betrayed them, tales that were whispered in hushed tones late at night. Whether every detail was true or not didn't matter. In the streets, perception was reality, and the perception was crystal clear, Alpo and Perry were untouchable. Yet behind the glamour of the partnership lay a growing dependence. Alpo, once the charismatic hustler who could win people with charm, began to lean more heavily on Perry's reputation for protection. It wasn't just about having muscle, it was about survival. The deeper Alpo waded into Washington's violent underworld, the more he relied on Perry to keep him above water. Every deal, every expansion, every rival silenced seemed to carry Perry's fingerprints. Alpo's empire no longer felt like his alone, it was a kingdom guarded by Perry's shadow. This dynamic created tension, not between the two men directly, but in the way others perceived them. Some whispered that Alpo was only powerful because of Perry, that without the enforcer's loyalty, Alpo would be just another flashy hustler destined to fall. Others argued that Perry's reach was amplified only because of Alpo's Harlem connections. The truth, as always, was somewhere in the middle. Together, they magnified each other's power. Apart, they might have burned out sooner. But in the streets, every partnership has an expiration date. Trust in the underworld is fragile, and dependence can easily turn to suspicion. Alpo knew that Perry's loyalty was priceless, but he also knew that such loyalty came with its own risks. Perry was not a man to be controlled, and Alpo was not a man to share the spotlight for long. Their alliance, while formidable, carried within it the seeds of eventual conflict. For now, though, the streets of Washington trembled under their rule. Clubs lit up when they entered, rivals backed away from corners they wanted, and the money stacked higher than ever. To outsiders, they seemed like brothers in arms, an unstoppable duo that would dominate for years to come. But to those watching closely, the cracks were already visible, the overconfidence, the paranoia, the reliance on violence as the answer to every question. The partnership with Perry marked a turning point in Alpo's story. It was the height of his empire, the peak of his control. Yet it was also the moment when his fate became tied to forces he could no longer fully manage. With Perry, Alpo felt invincible. But invincibility in the drug game is always an illusion, one that fades the moment paranoia, betrayal, or law enforcement step in. For now, though, Alpo and Perry stood together, two kings ruling a city where fear and ambition danced in the shadows of every block. At the height of Alpo Martinez's reign in Washington, D.C., money poured in so fast it seemed unreal. Stacks of cash filled apartments, cars, and duffel bags. He lived like a star, driving the newest foreign cars, wearing the finest designer clothes, and throwing parties that looked more like movie scenes than street gatherings. To the outside world, he had everything: wealth, respect, women, and influence. But beneath the glittering surface, a shadow began to grow. The same ambition that had carried Alpo to the top was also breeding something dangerous inside his circle: envy, distrust, and betrayal. The first cracks appeared quietly. In an empire built on loyalty, even small doubts could spread like wildfire. Rumors circulated, whispers that certain crew members were skimming money, cutting side deals, or talking too much. In the underworld, where paranoia was as common as currency, even the slightest suspicion could turn deadly. Alpo, once admired for his charisma and generosity, began to see threats everywhere. He was no longer just a hustler enjoying success, he had become a king watching for traitors in his court. The paranoia wasn't without cause. Washington was a city filled with hustlers who would do anything for a bigger slice of the pie. Rivals watched Alpo's success with envy, and even those closest to him sometimes dreamed of taking his place. In this environment, betrayal wasn't a possibility, it was an eventuality. The question wasn't if it would happen, but when. And Alpo, sharp and calculating, understood this truth all too well. He began to tighten control, watching his crew more carefully, demanding proof of loyalty, and leaning heavily on Wayne, Silk, Perry to enforce discipline. The relationship between paranoia and violence became a vicious cycle. The more Alpo suspected betrayal, the more violence he sanctioned to maintain control. Every move, every conversation, every look was scrutinized. Crew members who once laughed and partied with him now lived in silent fear, knowing that even the appearance of disloyalty could mean death. For Alpo, this transformation wasn't about cruelty, it was about survival. He believed that betrayal would kill him faster than any rival crew or police investigation, and so he chose to strike first. But paranoia has a way of poisoning everything it touches. The warmth of Alpo's charisma, the charm that once drew people to him, began to fade. He was still admired, still respected, but now there was distance in the air. Friends became employees became suspects, and trust became a rare commodity. Even those who remained loyal began to question how long they could survive in a world where loyalty was never enough. The ultimate test of loyalty came when business and friendship collided. In Alpo's world, the two could never truly be separated. Friends handled money, partners handled product, and loyalty was tested daily in the choices men made. Yet as the empire grew, these lines blurred. Greed tempted men who once swore allegiance. Pride pushed others to believe they deserved more. Alpo, always watching, always calculating, began to see betrayal not as an exception, but as a natural outcome of success. This mindset hardened him. Where once he gave chances, now he gave warnings. Where once he trusted, now he tested. Each act of enforcement strengthened his reputation but weakened his humanity. He was still the flashy, smiling figure at the clubs, but behind closed doors he was consumed by the question that haunted every kingpin: who can I really trust? The paranoia reached a peak in the way Alpo managed his closest relationships. Even allies who had proven themselves loyal were not immune to suspicion. One moment of doubt, one careless word, one unexplained absence could be enough to plant seeds of fear in Alpo's mind. He knew too well that betrayal often came not from enemies, but from friends who once swore loyalty. And so he acted accordingly, preemptively, ruthlessly, decisively. Yet, the cost of this mindset was immense. Every time he moved against someone suspected of betrayal, he tightened the circle of trust around him until it grew suffocatingly small. The empire that had once seemed like a family began to feel like a cage, with Alpo trapped inside his own need for control. He could buy cars, clothes, and homes, but he couldn't buy peace of mind. The nights that were once filled with laughter and music now carried an undercurrent of unease. Still, Alpo believed it was the price of survival. To him, paranoia wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. In a world where betrayal was inevitable, only those who struck first lived long enough to enjoy the rewards. But every act of paranoia-driven violence pushed him closer to the edge. The empire still stood, the money still flowed, and the legend still grew, but the foundation beneath it was beginning to crack. The irony was painful. The same charm and trust that had built Alpo's empire were being eroded by the very success they created. He had dreamed of power, of respect, of ruling a city through fearlessness. Now, fear ruled him. Each shadow looked like a threat, each ally looked like a rival, and each moment of silence carried the weight of suspicion. In Washington, the streets whispered his name louder than ever, but those whispers carried a new tone. No longer was he just admired for his flash or feared for his ruthlessness. Now, people spoke of his paranoia, his quickness to act, his willingness to turn on even those closest to him. Alpo was still untouchable, but untouchable came at a cost, the isolation of a man who could no longer trust the very circle that had once lifted him to the top. And in that isolation, the seeds of his eventual downfall were planted. For in the world of hustlers and kings, paranoia doesn't just protect, it corrodes. And when it corrodes too far, even the strongest empires can crumble from within. By the late 1980s, Alpo Martinez had reached a point where money seemed endless, cars and clothes were an extension of his personality, and his name alone carried weight from Harlem to Washington, D.C. But for all his success, the empire he built rested on fragile ground. The very foundations that made him powerful, loyalty, fear, and ambition, were beginning to fracture under the strain of greed and mistrust. It wasn't the rivals across town that posed the greatest threat to Alpo's empire. It was the men standing right beside him. In the underworld, betrayal often begins quietly. It doesn't come with bold announcements or open rebellion. Instead, it creeps in through whispers, side deals, and subtle changes in behavior. Alpo, already consumed by paranoia, noticed these signs everywhere. Crew members who once seemed devoted started missing meetings. Money wasn't always adding up. Some faces looked a little too eager when rivals were mentioned. For Alpo, who had always relied on his charm and charisma to hold people together, these cracks in loyalty felt personal. To him, betrayal wasn't just business, it was an attack on his very identity as a leader. One of the most infamous betrayals in Alpo's circle was tied to Rich Porter, a Harlem hustler who had been more than just a partner, he was a friend. Their relationship had started with mutual respect. Rich was known for his own style, ambition, and discipline. Together, they made moves that elevated both of their profiles. But as the money grew, so did the tension. Alpo began to suspect that Rich wasn't being transparent with the profits. Rumors swirled that Rich was holding back, possibly building his own empire independent of Alpo. Whether these rumors were entirely true or exaggerated by Alpo's paranoia remains debated to this day, but in Alpo's world, even the possibility of betrayal was too dangerous to ignore. The betrayal of Rich Porter became a defining moment in Alpo's story. To the outside world, it was shocking that he could turn on someone so close. To Alpo, it was survival. He convinced himself that eliminating Rich was a necessary move to protect his empire, his reputation, and his life. The decision reflected a grim truth about the drug game: loyalty had limits, and once suspicion entered the picture, even friendships forged in ambition could end in blood. When Rich was murdered, the streets buzzed with disbelief. People couldn't reconcile the image of Alpo, the charismatic hustler, with the ruthless execution of a friend. But for Alpo, it was a choice he felt forced to make, one that revealed just how far he had traveled from the boy who once hustled on Harlem's corners. Betrayal didn't just come from those closest to him, it was everywhere. Some of his crew in Washington began to look for ways out, fearing that Alpo's paranoia and reliance on Wayne, Silk, Perry made them expendable. Others quietly aligned themselves with rivals, hedging bets in case Alpo's empire collapsed. Even whispers of disloyalty carried consequences. Perry's presence ensured that betrayals were met with swift, often brutal punishment. But this constant cycle of suspicion and retaliation created an environment of fear that further eroded trust. The ripple effects of betrayal were devastating. Each violent act meant more attention from law enforcement, more questions from the streets, and more isolation for Alpo himself. The empire that had once seemed like a family now resembled a battlefield. Every handshake carried doubt, every promise felt fragile, and every relationship was strained by the knowledge that betrayal had already claimed those closest to him. What made this period of Alpo's life particularly tragic was the contrast between the image he projected and the reality he lived. To the outside world, he still seemed untouchable, riding through Harlem in luxury cars, flashing jewelry, and laughing in nightclubs. But behind that smile was a man haunted by the knowledge that betrayal could come at any moment. The paranoia that had once been a tool of survival had now become a prison. Even in his moments of triumph, Alpo was looking over his shoulder, questioning the loyalty of everyone around him. The story of betrayal in Alpo's empire highlights a larger truth about the world he lived in: power built on fear and greed can never truly last. The same men who cheer you in the club today may plot your downfall tomorrow. The same partners who build empires with you may decide that their future is brighter without you. Alpo, for all his charm and intelligence, could not escape this truth. His rise had been meteoric, but meteors burn out fast, leaving only ashes and the memory of their brilliance. The killing of Rich Porter marked more than just the loss of a friend, it marked the beginning of Alpo's decline. The streets, once filled with admiration for him, now whispered with suspicion. People questioned his judgment, his loyalty, and his humanity. Even those who still respected his power began to distance themselves, fearing that his paranoia would consume them too. Alpo's empire didn't collapse overnight, but the cracks had widened. Trust had evaporated, and once trust is gone, an empire cannot stand. In hindsight, betrayal wasn't just an obstacle in Alpo's path, it was the turning point that sealed his fate. It revealed the cost of his ambition, the fragility of his relationships, and the truth that in the underworld, no partnership is sacred. Betrayal isn't an exception, it's the rule. And Alpo, despite all his charisma and vision, could not escape it. For the listeners drifting off as this story unfolds, this chapter of betrayal is both chilling and sobering. It reminds us that the glitter of the street life hides shadows that grow darker the higher one climbs. For Alpo, betrayal was not just a possibility he feared, it was the reality that forever altered his path, pulling him closer to the inevitable downfall that awaited him. By the early 1990s, Alpo Martinez's empire stood at a dangerous crossroads. He had conquered Harlem, extended his reach into Washington, D.C., and become one of the most talked-about figures in the drug trade. Yet the very success that elevated him into legend had also placed a target on his back. Law enforcement agencies, once fragmented in their investigations, had begun to connect the dots. The whispers on the streets of Harlem, the trails of money, the bodies left in the wake of violent disputes, all pointed toward Alpo. For years, he had managed to stay ahead, relying on his charm, his cunning, and his ruthless enforcement through Wayne, Silk, Perry. But as the law closed in, the game was changing. The pressure was not just local anymore. federal investigators had taken notice. What had once been scattered cases and minor arrests began to consolidate into a larger, coordinated effort. The FBI, DEA, and local police worked in unison, pooling intelligence to build a case strong enough to bring Alpo down. Surveillance operations became more advanced, wiretaps more precise, and informants more willing to speak. Where once Alpo had moved freely through Harlem streets, now he was unknowingly watched from unmarked cars, followed by silent tales, and discussed in law enforcement strategy rooms as a top priority target. What made the pressure even heavier was Alpo's growing notoriety. Unlike the quiet, disciplined hustlers who tried to avoid the spotlight, Alpo was a celebrity in the underworld. His flashy cars, expensive clothes, and constant presence at Harlem's hotspots drew attention, not just from admirers but from the authorities eager to make an example out of him. Every photograph of him stepping out of a luxury ride, every rumor of his spending sprees, every whispered story of his ruthlessness made him an irresistible target for prosecutors looking to build a high-profile case. In many ways, Alpo's own charisma had betrayed him, turning him from a ghost into a spectacle. Inside his empire, the mounting law enforcement presence created an atmosphere of paranoia. Raids struck the homes of associates. Longtime allies disappeared, either arrested or quietly slipping away to protect themselves. Some flipped, feeding information to federal agents in exchange for lighter sentences. Alpo's crew was no longer the tight-knit group it once was, it was fractured, fearful, and desperate. And Alpo, once the master manipulator who could charm and command loyalty, found himself relying more and more on fear to keep the walls from caving in. The murder of Rich Porter had also placed Alpo under scrutiny. Though he had believed it was a calculated move to protect himself, it instead became a shadow that followed him everywhere. Whispers on the streets turned into testimonies behind closed doors. People who had once been silent now used that murder as evidence of his ruthlessness, painting him not just as a dealer but as a cold-blooded killer. Law enforcement eagerly seized upon these narratives, weaving them into a case that portrayed Alpo as not only a kingpin but also a murderer, capable of discarding even his closest allies when threatened. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the violent reign of Wayne "Silk" Perry brought additional heat. Perry's reputation as a feared enforcer had kept rivals at bay, but it also left a trail of bodies that authorities could not ignore. With each killing tied back to Alpo's empire, the noose tightened. The very man who had made Alpo feel untouchable was now the reason investigators had more ammunition to bring him down. As the legal pressure mounted, Alpo began to experience something unfamiliar: isolation. Once surrounded by friends, women, and admirers, he now found himself questioning who he could trust. Every knock on the door felt like a raid. Every phone call might be tapped. The laughter and celebrations that once filled his nights gave way to quiet, restless hours of worry. He had lived so long as a man in control, but now control was slipping through his fingers. The story of Alpo's legal downfall also reveals a deeper irony: the same ambition that had propelled him to the top ensured that his fall would be public and devastating. He wasn't just another hustler to be arrested and forgotten, he was a symbol of Harlem's flashy drug era, a man whose name had become synonymous with the excesses and dangers of the trade. Law enforcement wanted him not only behind bars but also disgraced, a cautionary tale for those who dreamed of following in his footsteps. The day finally came when the law's grip became unavoidable. Arrests were made, charges stacked, and prosecutors unveiled an array of evidence, testimonies, surveillance, and physical proof, that painted a damning picture. For Alpo, it was the beginning of a nightmare he could not charm his way out of. The empire that once seemed limitless now stood on the verge of collapse. The very walls that had shielded him for years had turned into cages, closing in from every side. Yet even as he faced mounting charges, Alpo's story took a twist that few could have predicted. His response to the legal pressure, his decision on how to survive, would redefine his legacy in ways far more controversial than any murder or betrayal could. But at this stage, as law enforcement's net closed tight, the once untouchable hustler was forced to confront a reality that even he could not outmaneuver: the system was bigger, stronger, and more relentless than any street empire he had ever built. As you drift deeper into this part of the story, the imagery is one of contrast. The bright lights of Harlem nightclubs fade into the sterile glow of police offices where Alpo's name is scrawled across whiteboards. The roar of sports cars is replaced by the low hum of wiretaps. The laughter of his entourage is drowned by the silence of paranoia. It is here, in this transition, that the legend of Alpo begins to unravel. Not with one dramatic moment, but with a steady, crushing pressure that even the most charismatic hustler could not escape. The moment that had long been feared by Alpo Martinez, and eagerly awaited by both rivals and investigators, finally arrived. The walls had closed in. After years of dodging suspicion, outmaneuvering rivals, and surviving betrayals, Alpo found himself in the custody of the very system he had spent a lifetime evading. For a man who had built his name on being untouchable, the arrest was not just a legal blow, it was a psychological one. The man who once rode through Harlem streets with an air of invincibility now faced the cold reality of handcuffs, interrogation rooms, and a mountain of charges that threatened to bury him for the rest of his life. The charges were devastating. Murder, conspiracy, drug trafficking, the list was long and designed to ensure that Alpo would never see the outside world again. Prosecutors painted him as the mastermind of a violent empire, a man who had profited from destruction while discarding even his closest friends. They had evidence, they had witnesses, and above all, they had momentum. The government had invested years into dismantling his empire, and now that they had him, they weren't about to let go. Alpo was facing life without parole, a sentence that promised no luxury cars, no nightclubs, no second chances. What made this moment even heavier was the collapse of the support system that had once defined his strength. Associates who once swore loyalty were gone, some locked up, others turning into informants themselves. Wayne "Silk" Perry, once his iron fist in Washington, was behind bars and facing his own charges. The larger-than-life image of Alpo as a Harlem hustler-turned-mythic figure was now reduced to a man staring down decades of isolation. For the first time, charm and charisma weren't enough. The prosecutors didn't care about his smile, and the jury wasn't swayed by his style. The law had stripped him down to the raw facts: Alpo Martinez, a man accused of orchestrating death and destruction for profit. In this pressure cooker, Alpo made the choice that would redefine his name forever. Faced with the reality of spending the rest of his life in prison, he chose to cooperate with the government. The decision shocked many, not just in Harlem but across the entire street world. Alpo, once the symbol of flash and loyalty, chose to testify against others in exchange for leniency. It was a move that ensured his survival, but it also destroyed the very foundation of the myth he had built. To understand the gravity of this choice, one must step into the code of the streets. In the underworld, cooperation with law enforcement, snitching, is considered the ultimate betrayal. It's worse than turning on a partner, worse than stealing money. It's the one act that brands a man permanently, erasing all prior respect. Alpo's cooperation meant that the same charisma that once drew people to him was now used in sterile courtrooms, as he pointed fingers and detailed the inner workings of his empire. Each word he spoke was another nail in the coffin of his reputation. Yet from Alpo's perspective, the decision was about survival. For all his bravado, he was a man staring at death by incarceration. The idea of living out his days in a cell, with nothing but memory and regret, terrified him. Cooperation offered a lifeline. It meant protection, a chance at reduced sentencing, perhaps even the possibility of one day walking the streets again. To Alpo, who had always been about staying ahead, it was just another calculation, another hustle. But unlike his deals on the streets, this one came at the expense of everything he had ever stood for. The fallout was immediate. The streets of Harlem buzzed with anger, disbelief, and betrayal. Men who had once admired Alpo now cursed his name. His story, once one of ambition and style, became a cautionary tale about greed and weakness. Even those who had never met him felt personally betrayed, as if his cooperation tainted the myth of Harlem hustlers as a whole. The same community that had celebrated his rise now turned its back, branding him a pariah. For listeners imagining this moment, picture the contrast. The man who once strutted through nightclubs with gold chains now sits under fluorescent lights in a courtroom, dressed in a suit chosen by his lawyer, speaking into a microphone as prosecutors nod approvingly. The man who once inspired awe now inspires disgust. It is the ultimate reversal, a fall not just from power but from respect, from legacy, from myth to infamy. The emotional weight of this chapter lies in the silence that followed. For Alpo, cooperation brought survival, but it also brought exile. He could no longer walk through Harlem freely. The neighborhoods that once cheered his name now viewed him with contempt. Even if he was physically alive, the legend of Alpo Martinez had died in those courtrooms. His name was etched not as a hustler who beat the odds, but as the hustler who broke the code. And yet, this decision would not be the end of his story. Far from it. Cooperation would shape the next phase of his life, creating a strange existence where he lived between survival and shame, safety and isolation. It marked the transition from Alpo the hustler to Alpo the pariah, setting the stage for the years of witness protection, secrecy, and the haunting realization that while he had escaped a life sentence, he could never escape his past. This turning point in Alpo's story is not just about the fall of one man, it's about the fragility of reputation in the underworld. It shows that no matter how powerful or admired someone becomes, one decision can erase it all. For Alpo, the arrest and cooperation were the moments that sealed his fate. He had built a life on fast money and faster choices, but in the end, his most consequential choice was made not on the streets of Harlem but in the quiet desperation of a courtroom. As you drift deeper into this chapter, let the imagery linger, the sound of handcuffs clicking shut, the echo of footsteps in prison corridors, the hush of a courtroom as a once feared hustler begins to speak. It is a reminder that even legends fall, and sometimes the loudest collapse comes not from bullets in the night but from words spoken under oath. After the courtrooms had emptied, the sentences had been handed down, and the betrayals had been sealed in testimony, Alpo Martinez entered a new phase of life, one that looked nothing like the streets of Harlem or the bustling empire he once ruled. Instead of luxury cars and crowded nightclubs, his days were now defined by secrecy, relocation, and the constant shadow of danger. Alpo had chosen survival over silence, and in exchange for his cooperation, the government placed him into the witness protection program. It was a strange ending for a man who had once embodied the very essence of Harlem's flashiest hustle, to be alive, but stripped of the very identity that made him who he was. Witness protection was never going to feel like home for Alpo. For years, he had thrived on attention, drawing crowds wherever he went, turning sidewalks into stages for his style and swagger. Now, the government's version of safety meant erasing that identity. New name, new residence, new routines. The same man who once defined Harlem nightlife was now expected to blend into anonymity, to live quietly in suburbs or small towns where nobody knew the legend of Alpo Martinez. For him, this was both salvation and a slow kind of death. In these new surroundings, Alpo wrestled with himself. The adrenaline rush of the streets had been replaced with monotony. The man who once counted stacks of money every night now clocked hours in ordinary settings, stripped of the empire that had defined his existence. Some reports suggest he tried to build new ventures, attempting to adjust to a life without the flash and chaos. Yet even in this new life, he couldn't escape his old one. Paranoia remained constant. Every unfamiliar car in the neighborhood, every stranger's glance in a grocery store, carried the weight of potential danger. The enemies he had made in Harlem and Washington were not bound by geography. Word could spread, and retribution could find him anywhere. More than the fear, however, was the haunting awareness that his reputation had been shattered. Among the underworld, his name had once commanded respect. Now, it was associated with betrayal, with cooperation, with the breaking of a code that had defined the culture he came from. In Harlem, his story became a cautionary tale. Younger hustlers studied his life not for inspiration but as a warning: no matter how high you rise, one wrong move, or one desperate decision, can destroy it all. The man who had once embodied Harlem's glamour was now remembered as the hustler who chose to testify. That stain never left him. For Alpo himself, the years in witness protection created a kind of dual existence. Outwardly, he played the role required of him, low profile, cautious, invisible. But inside, he was still the Harlem hustler. He still carried the memories of nights filled with wealth and attention, still replayed the choices that had led him here. The contrast between who he once was and who he had become gnawed at him. He was alive, yes, but he was also cut off from the stage where he had once thrived. Life without Harlem, without recognition, felt incomplete. And so, Alpo began to test the boundaries. Reports and street whispers suggested that even during his time under witness protection, he couldn't fully detach from the persona he had built. He reached out to old contacts, hinted at his past, and in some ways seemed drawn to the very spotlight that had doomed him. It was as if Alpo could never truly bury Alpo Martinez, no matter what name the government handed him. He was addicted not just to the streets but to the recognition, to the myth of himself. This contradiction defined his life in hiding. On one hand, he had escaped what seemed like certain life imprisonment. On the other, he was trapped in an existence that demanded he suppress the very essence of his being. He was a man split between survival and identity, between anonymity and infamy. The program may have provided safety from immediate threats, but it could not protect him from his own restlessness, his own yearning to be remembered as more than a man who had cut a deal. The community he left behind also continued to wrestle with his story. For some, Alpo became a ghostly figure, spoken of in whispers, remembered in documentaries and street tales, debated on corners late into the night. For others, he was simply erased, a fallen figure whose choices invalidated his legacy. The cultural memory of Harlem's hustlers couldn't ignore him, but it couldn't embrace him either. He became a symbol of contradiction, the rise and fall of a hustler, the myth and the man, the survivor and the betrayer. The emotional weight of these years lay not in violence or chaos, but in quiet. For a man who once lived in noise, the roar of engines, the rhythm of music, the chatter of entourages, the silence of witness protection was perhaps the harshest punishment. It forced Alpo to sit with himself, to confront his decisions without distraction. No amount of government relocation could shield him from the truth that survival had come at the cost of his identity, his friendships, and his legend. Yet, as history would later show, Alpo could not remain in that quiet forever. The pull of Harlem, of recognition, of reclaiming even a sliver of his former identity, would eventually draw him back. The witness protection years were not an ending, but a pause, a liminal space where Alpo lived suspended between two worlds, unable to fully belong to either. As listeners drift further into the story, picture this paradox. Imagine the man who once ruled Harlem's avenues now walking unnoticed through suburban streets, carrying groceries instead of gold chains, glancing over his shoulder instead of waving to admirers. Imagine the silence of rooms where his name meant nothing, contrasted with the buzzing energy of the streets that still debated his legacy. This was Alpo's world after cooperation, alive, yet not truly living. A survivor, but also a shadow of himself. The years Alpo Martinez spent under the veil of witness protection were meant to erase him from the world he once ruled. For the government, it was a way to ensure his survival. For Alpo, however, it was like living in a cage of anonymity. The man who once basked in Harlem's spotlight now found himself living in the shadows, stripped of the adoration, the fear, and the attention that had once defined his existence. No matter how far he was relocated or how carefully he was hidden, one truth persisted: Alpo was Harlem, and Harlem was Alpo. That connection, like a magnetic pull, would eventually draw him back to the very place he had been warned never to return. For Alpo, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood, it was the stage on which he had built his myth. Every street corner, every brownstone, every nightclub carried memories of his rise. Walking away from it permanently was something he could never truly do. Witness protection had kept him physically safe, but emotionally, it starved him. The silence, the anonymity, the absence of recognition wore on him like a slow poison. For a man whose identity had been tied to flash, respect, and status, blending into suburbia felt like being erased. As time passed, whispers began to circulate. Alpo had been seen again. First, it was rumored sightings, fleeting glimpses of a familiar face in Harlem. Then, photos began to surface, Alpo back in the city, riding his bicycle through the very streets that had once made him a king. The return was shocking, not just because it defied the logic of witness protection, but because it carried immense risk. By coming back, Alpo wasn't just flirting with danger, he was inviting it. Harlem hadn't forgotten. The betrayals, the murders, and above all, the cooperation with law enforcement had left scars that time had not healed. His return wasn't greeted with applause. It was met with quiet hostility, disbelief, and a sense that he was tempting fate. What made his return even more complex was Alpo's demeanor. He didn't slink back in quietly. Instead, he carried himself with the same flair that had once defined him, smiling, talking openly, even engaging with younger generations who knew him more from documentaries and lore than personal memory. For the youth, Alpo was a living legend, a myth come to life. For the older generation, particularly those who had lived through his rise and fall, his presence was almost offensive. He represented not just betrayal but the unraveling of a code that many still held sacred. Alpo's decision to return spoke to something deeper than recklessness. It revealed a man unwilling to let go of his identity, even at the cost of his safety. To him, being remembered, being seen, was worth more than living quietly in obscurity. The same hunger for recognition that once drove him to build an empire now drove him to risk his life. He could have remained hidden, alive but forgotten. Instead, he chose to reinsert himself into the narrative, to remind Harlem that he was still here. But Harlem had changed. The streets he once ruled were no longer the same battlegrounds. New generations of hustlers had taken over, with different codes, different ambitions. The crack era had faded, replaced by new economies and new players. For Alpo, walking these streets again must have felt like walking through a ghost town of his own memories. Every corner carried echoes of what once was, deals made, alliances forged, betrayals sealed. And yet, the city itself had moved on. Harlem remembered him, but not with admiration. His name was tied to betrayal, and no amount of swagger could erase that. The irony of his return was stark. Here was a man who had escaped a life sentence through cooperation, who had been given the rare chance to disappear and survive. Yet he chose to step back into the spotlight, to live once again in the place where his legend was both born and destroyed. Some saw it as arrogance, others as loneliness, and still others as the inevitable pull of a man who could not exist without recognition. Whatever the reason, his presence was a reminder that in the underworld, ghosts never rest. Imagine the scene, Alpo riding through Harlem on a bicycle, smiling, waving, as if daring the world to acknowledge him. Some younger kids, curious about the stories they had heard, looked at him with fascination. Older faces, hardened by memory, turned away in disgust. Conversations sparked quietly in barbershops and on corners. Can you believe he's back? After all that, he came back here. His return reopened wounds, stirred old resentments, and created a sense of inevitability. A man who lived by risk had returned to risk it all once more. For Alpo, though, this was not about logic. It was about reclaiming a piece of himself. The quiet life had suffocated him. The spotlight, even a hostile one, gave him life again. By being back in Harlem, even under the cloud of betrayal, he felt alive in a way witness protection never could provide. It was as if he preferred danger to invisibility, infamy to erasure. The tragedy of his return is that it carried within it the seeds of his end. Every move he made, every appearance in Harlem, was a gamble. Each day was a reminder that survival and identity were pulling him in opposite directions. By stepping back into the streets, Alpo wasn't just visiting his past, he was inviting his future. And in the unforgiving code of the underworld, the past always has a way of catching up. As you drift into this part of the story, imagine the haunting duality, a man once feared and admired now pedaling quietly through the streets he once ruled, a ghost among the living. The echoes of applause had long faded, replaced with silence and judgment. And yet, for Alpo, even that silence was preferable to being forgotten. His return to Harlem was not just a physical act, it was a statement, a dangerous declaration that he would rather face the consequences than live without the recognition that had always defined him. The night of Alpo Martinez's death was not a sudden twist of fate, but rather the culmination of years of choices, betrayals, and risks that had circled back to him like vultures waiting for their prey. It was Halloween night in 2021, a night when the streets of Harlem were alive with energy, costumes, and the kind of noisy distraction that cloaked darker movements. The city was buzzing with the carefree chaos of celebration, but for Alpo, that night carried a different energy, an eerie quiet beneath the noise, a sense of inevitability lingering in the air. In the days leading up to that night, Alpo had been seen around Harlem more frequently, moving with a boldness that startled those who remembered his past. He wasn't hiding, and in fact, seemed to relish being recognized, even if recognition came with resentment. Riding his motorcycle, sitting in his truck, speaking with people on the corners, he was making himself visible. Some saw this as arrogance, a taunt to those who still held grudges. Others interpreted it as a man tempting fate, knowingly pushing the boundaries of how long he could cheat death. Whatever the interpretation, one truth was clear, Alpo was playing a dangerous game, and the streets of Harlem had never been a forgiving arena. On Halloween night, he was behind the wheel of his Dodge Ram pickup, cruising through the neighborhood. To the casual eye, it looked like an ordinary evening, just another man driving through the city. But beneath the surface, eyes were watching. Harlem was not blind to his presence. Old wounds run deep, and in the underworld, debts of betrayal are rarely left unpaid. His very existence back in the neighborhood was a provocation, a reminder of broken codes, of lives lost because of his cooperation with authorities. For some, this was not just about anger, it was about honor, about settling accounts that had been left open for decades. The hours before his death were a mix of routine and recklessness. He had stopped to see acquaintances, exchanged words with those who dared approach, and carried himself as though untouchable. Yet, those who knew the streets understood that his confidence was misplaced. For all his past cunning, Alpo seemed blind to the fact that he had already crossed the point of no return. His visibility, his bravado, and his willingness to reinsert himself into Harlem's bloodstream were not acts of survival, they were acts of defiance against inevitability. Around 3 a.m., the quiet hours when the celebrations of Halloween had thinned and the streets were sparsely filled, Alpo's Dodge Ram became the stage for his final scene. As he drove through Harlem, shots rang out, sharp cracks that shattered the silence of the early morning. Bullets ripped through his truck, piercing the night and sealing his fate. He was struck multiple times in the chest, and though he attempted to drive off, his strength and control quickly failed. The truck veered and eventually came to a stop, its driver slumped, lifeless, inside. The aftermath was swift yet surreal. Police arrived to find a man once mythologized in Harlem lore, now reduced to just another casualty of the streets he had once ruled. The truck's windows were shattered, its frame marked by gunfire, and inside lay the body of a man who had spent his life running from fate, only to collide with it in the very place he thought he could reclaim. The irony was stark. Alpo, who had escaped prison, who had survived the dangerous life of a kingpin, who had outlived countless enemies by choosing to cooperate, had been brought down not by the justice system, but by the code of the streets he had defied. Word of his death spread like wildfire. By morning, Harlem was buzzing. Social media lit up with videos of the scene, photos of the bullet-riddled truck, and commentary that ranged from cold satisfaction to somber reflection. Some spoke of justice served, that a man who had betrayed his partners and violated the sacred code of silence had finally received the punishment he had long evaded. Others saw it as a tragedy, a reminder of how the cycle of violence and revenge never truly ends, that even decades later, the past remains alive, waiting to claim those who dare confront it. The details of who pulled the trigger remain shrouded in mystery. Speculation abounded. Was it personal vengeance from someone tied to his betrayals, a calculated act by those still loyal to the code, or simply a crime of opportunity by someone seeking notoriety? The lack of clarity only deepened the mystique of his end, making it less a clean resolution and more an open-ended chapter that kept Harlem talking. In a way, even his death carried the same energy as his life, provocative, polarizing, and steeped in legend. Yet, what made his death particularly haunting was the sense that Alpo himself had courted it. By returning to Harlem, by showing his face, by refusing to disappear into anonymity, he had essentially chosen this path. It was as if he had decided that living forgotten was worse than dying remembered. He had walked into Harlem as though daring the streets to respond, and on that Halloween night, they did. His death was not a random act, nor a sudden betrayal of fortune. It was the inevitable end to a story written long ago, when choices were made, codes were broken, and reputations were traded for survival. For Harlem, the morning after his death was a reflection of its complicated relationship with Alpo. Some mourned him as a symbol of a bygone era, a man whose life embodied the rise and fall of the crack age. Others rejected any sentiment, pointing to the lives lost because of his actions, the families torn apart by his betrayals, and the principles he had trampled. His death was not mourned in unison, it was dissected, debated, and processed through the lens of individual memory and personal connection. As his body was removed from the scene, the streets whispered with the same duality that had always surrounded his name: admiration and contempt, fascination and disgust. In the end, Alpo Martinez did not die quietly in witness protection, forgotten by history. He died in Harlem, in the city that had made him and destroyed him, in the only place he had ever truly belonged. His end was bloody, dramatic, and public, fitting for a man who had always lived in extremes, who had never been content with silence, and who chose recognition, even in death, over anonymity in life. His final night was not just the end of Alpo Martinez. It was the closing of a chapter in Harlem's history, a reminder that the past never truly disappears, that choices echo through decades, and that in the underworld, every betrayal waits patiently for its moment to return. On that Halloween night, as the city celebrated in masks and costumes, one mask fell forever, and the streets claimed back one of their most infamous sons. The morning after Alpo Martinez's death, Harlem awoke to a strange quiet. The Halloween decorations were still fluttering on stoops and streetlights, but the celebration had turned into whispers, questions, and a wave of gossip that moved faster than any official report. Alpo's name was on every corner, every phone call, every social media feed. The once feared Harlem hustler who had lived through bullets, betrayals, and prison was now gone. His body had been carried away, but the aftermath was only just beginning. News outlets quickly picked up the story, flashing headlines that carried a mix of shock and inevitability: Alpo Martinez shot dead in Harlem. For the general public, it was another tragic story of a gangster brought down by the life he chose. For Harlem, however, it was something far more layered. The reaction split sharply, reflecting the deep divisions that Alpo's life had always created. Some spoke with almost celebratory tones, calling his death justice delayed, but justice served. Others expressed sadness, not necessarily for the man himself, but for what his death symbolized, a reminder of a turbulent era that had never fully healed. On the streets, old wounds reopened. Families of men Alpo had betrayed or testified against saw the news as closure. They had carried scars for decades, living with the memory that their loved ones were gone while Alpo walked free. To them, his death was not random, it was the long-awaited settling of accounts. Social media was filled with comments from people saying things like, "The streets never forget," and "You reap what you sow." Harlem, always known for its unfiltered honesty, did not soften its words for Alpo's passing. Yet, not everyone viewed it with such certainty. There were those who remembered Alpo as the daring, charismatic figure of the 1980s, a man who brought energy to Harlem, who made money flow, and who embodied the highs and lows of street hustling during the crack era. For them, his death brought a sense of nostalgia and melancholy. They remembered the young man in flashy cars, the one who turned corners into stages, who wore Harlem's ambition like a crown. His end was a reminder that time had moved on, and with it, an entire generation of hustlers whose choices had carved Harlem's identity in painful, unforgettable ways. In the days after his death, makeshift memorials appeared near the site of the shooting. Candles flickered on the sidewalk, photos were taped to street poles, and people gathered quietly to pay respects, or to simply see where the story had ended. These gatherings reflected Harlem's complexity. Some came to honor the man, while others came simply to witness history, to stand at the crossroads of legend and consequence. The funeral arrangements added another layer of tension. Alpo was both infamous and iconic, which meant his send-off could not escape controversy. His family, who had carried the burden of his reputation for years, faced the difficult task of mourning privately while the public dissected his life. At the funeral, whispers filled the air as people debated whether he deserved the flowers, the prayers, or even the recognition. Some mourners came with genuine grief, while others came with curiosity, as though they were watching the final act of a play that had captivated Harlem for decades. The service itself reflected this duality. Ministers spoke of forgiveness, of leaving judgment to God, and of the importance of learning from the choices that shape lives. But even within the sanctuary, the weight of Alpo's past lingered. Every eulogy, every word of comfort, was shadowed by the knowledge that this was a man who had taken lives, betrayed friends, and broken codes. For many, reconciling the man they once admired with the man he became was impossible. On the streets outside, the conversations continued. Some young men, too young to have lived through Alpo's prime, looked at his story as a cautionary tale. They saw his rise and fall as proof that street glory is fleeting, that betrayal has consequences, and that the spotlight eventually burns those who stand in it too long. For older Harlem residents, the funeral was a reminder of just how much the crack era had scarred their community. The pain of addiction, violence, and betrayal still echoed in their memories, and Alpo's death forced those memories back to the surface. Meanwhile, the broader public consumed the story in waves of fascination. Documentaries, interviews, and discussions about Alpo's life surged online, as if death had reignited interest in the man behind the myth. Videos of his last days circulated, his motorcycle rides, his truck with tinted windows, his bold appearances in Harlem. The contrast was chilling. Only weeks earlier, he had walked those same streets with confidence, and now he was gone. For Harlem, the aftermath wasn't just about one man's death, it was about what his story represented. Alpo symbolized a time when ambition and danger walked hand in hand, when the lure of fast money clashed with the codes of loyalty, and when betrayal could carry you far, but never far enough. His death sparked conversations about loyalty, survival, and the price of choices. Parents told their children his story, not to glorify, but to warn, this is where that path leads. Yet, despite the lessons, the debates, and the closure his death brought, there remained a haunting truth. Alpo Martinez had chosen visibility, chosen to step back into Harlem's gaze, and in doing so, had sealed his fate. His death left behind no tidy resolution, only a trail of questions, emotions, and reflections that would ripple through Harlem for years. In the end, the aftermath was not about celebrating or condemning him entirely. It was about grappling with the contradictions of his life, the charm and the ruthlessness, the ambition and the betrayal, the survival and the downfall. Harlem was left with the image of a man whose story had stretched across decades, whose name would forever stir both admiration and anger, and whose end had forced a community to look once more at the shadows of its own past. Alpo's funeral, his memorials, and the endless conversations that followed did not close the book on his life, they reopened it. His death was not just the end of a man, but the resurgence of a legend, a symbol, and a reminder that the streets may forgive time, but they never forgive betrayal. And so, even as his body was laid to rest, his story continued to breathe, to divide, and to echo through the avenues of Harlem. In the weeks and months that followed Alpo Martinez's death, Harlem and the broader underworld began to process what had happened. His killing was more than just the end of one man, it was the closing of a volatile chapter in the city's history, and yet it stirred new debates, new reflections, and new divides. For some, the silence that followed his funeral was a relief, like a wound finally bandaged. For others, the silence was uneasy, as though Harlem itself was still trying to decide what Alpo's death really meant. Walking through the neighborhoods where he once held influence, the echoes of Alpo's story lingered. On one hand, there was a palpable sense of justice delivered. Many in Harlem had carried the sting of betrayal for decades. They remembered not only his reign as a drug kingpin but also the way he had turned on his partners to save himself. In the underworld, betrayal is a wound that never fully heals, and his death reopened that scar before finally stitching it shut. Older voices on stoops and barbershops would shake their heads, saying things like, "He had it coming," or, "That's the life, no one escapes it." These were not words of celebration but of resignation, as though Alpo's end had proven a lesson long understood. Yet, for another part of Harlem, his death left a complicated void. To some, Alpo represented a kind of larger-than-life figure whose charisma and daring had made him unforgettable. They spoke not only of the betrayals but also of the energy he brought to Harlem during his rise, the way his name carried weight, the way he embodied the ambition and hunger of a generation that sought to rise out of poverty at any cost. His presence was not just criminal, it was cultural. For this group, his death was a reminder that Harlem's legends, for better or worse, were fading away, replaced by a new era that lacked the same mythic energy. Beyond Harlem, the broader underworld looked at Alpo's death as a cautionary tale. His life story, already famous, now carried the finality of a violent ending that reaffirmed the code. For those still in the game, it was a chilling reminder that cooperation with authorities may offer short-term survival, but it leaves a stain that time cannot wash away. In circles where loyalty is currency, Alpo's name became a synonym for betrayal and the inevitable price it demands. Discussions in prison yards, in street corners, and even in whispered conversations across the country pointed back to him as an example. Look at Alpo. You can't escape the streets forever. Social media amplified these reflections. Documentaries and interviews about his life gained millions of views in the months after his death, as new audiences, many of them too young to remember the 1980s crack era, became fascinated by his story. To them, Alpo was not just a gangster but a character, a figure from a time when Harlem was both glamorous and devastating. The renewed spotlight ensured that his name would not fade quickly, and with each retelling, the debates about his legacy sharpened. The younger generation, especially those who grew up hearing fragments of Alpo's legend, wrestled with the contradictions. On one side, they admired his audacity, the way he had risen from the streets to power. On the other, they could not ignore that his choices destroyed lives and that his betrayal had broken the very code that sustained the underworld. Some viewed him as a cautionary tale, others as a symbol of Harlem's past bravado. But almost all agreed that his story carried lessons, about ambition, about loyalty, about survival, and about the consequences of each. Harlem itself seemed to breathe differently in those months. The corner where his truck was riddled with bullets became a quiet landmark of sorts. People passed by with a nod, a whisper, or a pause. Some placed flowers there for weeks, as though honoring not the man but the moment. Others shook their heads and muttered that it was finally over. In conversations, his name carried both weight and weariness. People were drawn to his story but also tired of its shadow. What stood out most was the way Alpo's death reignited conversations about the crack era. Older Harlem residents spoke openly about the devastation of those years, about how men like Alpo had profited while neighborhoods suffered. His story forced the city to confront its past, the glamour of fast money versus the deep wounds it left behind. To many, his death was symbolic of a cycle that had taken too much from Harlem and left scars that could never fully heal. Even in music and culture, reflections surfaced. Rappers referenced his name, not always in reverence but as a shorthand for betrayal, survival, and the complex dance between fame and infamy. Podcasters and storytellers debated his legacy, asking whether he should be remembered as a hustler who reached the top, or as a man undone by his own choices. The very mention of his name sparked emotions, which showed that even in death, Alpo's story still commanded attention. And then there were those who saw something almost tragic in his return to Harlem. They argued that Alpo had chosen death by choosing visibility, that he knew the risks but preferred to go out as a legend rather than fade into obscurity. To them, his death was not just an ending, it was his final performance, his last act of defiance against the anonymity that awaited him elsewhere. The underworld recognized that choice, and it only deepened the conversation. Was he reckless, or was he simply unwilling to die forgotten? Months later, as the shock wore off, Harlem began to fold Alpo's death into its history. The debates continued, but slowly, the noise softened. People moved on with their lives, but his story remained part of Harlem's DNA, a cautionary tale whispered to the young, a point of reflection for the old, and a reminder that choices echo far beyond the moment they're made. In the end, Alpo's legacy in the months after his death was not one of resolution, but of reflection. His name became a mirror through which Harlem and the underworld examined themselves, their codes, their histories, their ambitions, and their losses. Whether seen as a villain, a legend, or a man who fell victim to his own choices, Alpo Martinez remained unforgettable. His story lingered not because of how he lived or how he died, but because of the questions he left behind, questions about loyalty, survival, and the ultimate cost of the hustle. In the aftermath of Alpo Martinez's death, the media machine roared to life. Newspapers, television, podcasts, and especially social media became flooded with his story, each outlet framing him in its own way. For Harlem, Alpo's killing had been a street-level reckoning, but for the wider world, it was another chance to dissect, dramatize, and mythologize one of the most notorious hustlers of the crack era. His name, once whispered in fear and fascination, was now back in headlines, trending hashtags, and countless debates. Documentaries that had once seemed like niche explorations of Harlem's underworld surged in popularity. Older films like Paid in Full, a dramatization inspired by the lives of Alpo, Rich Porter, and Azie Faison, were rediscovered by younger audiences. Streaming platforms noticed the renewed interest, pushing crime documentaries and interviews that chronicled Alpo's life. Suddenly, clips of his rare recorded statements, his prison interviews, and even grainy street footage of him riding his motorcycle through Harlem were being shared across TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. The media fascination spoke to something deeper. Alpo's life carried every element of a gripping narrative. He was a young man who rose from poverty into power, who lived lavishly, betrayed allies, faced prison, survived, and ultimately died violently in the same streets that raised him. It was, in many ways, the blueprint for gangster storytelling, one that blurred the lines between admiration and condemnation. The media knew this tension well and exploited it, offering viewers both the thrill of his legend and the caution of his downfall. Podcasters and YouTubers, especially those dedicated to true crime and street culture, rushed to release content dissecting his story. Some focused on the betrayal that defined his later years, branding him as the ultimate cautionary tale of disloyalty. Others romanticized his rise, painting him as a Harlem Robin Hood who brought energy, style, and excitement to the neighborhood before it all went wrong. Each narrative found an audience, because Alpo's story, like Harlem itself, was layered, contradictory, and impossible to reduce to a single truth. Music also played a role in cementing his myth. Rappers who grew up during or after the crack era referenced his name in their lyrics, sometimes as a symbol of betrayal, other times as shorthand for ambition gone wrong. To call someone an Alpo became slang in certain circles, meaning someone who had broken trust for survival. His story, already entrenched in hip-hop culture through Paid in Full and street legends, now had a tragic final act that reinforced his symbolic weight. At the same time, mainstream media outlets tried to contextualize his life in broader terms. They examined the crack epidemic of the 1980s, the devastation it brought to black communities, and how figures like Alpo both profited from and perpetuated that destruction. For them, his death was not just about one man but about the consequences of an entire era of failed policies, broken neighborhoods, and underground economies. These stories offered a sobering reminder that while Alpo had lived flamboyantly, many around him had only known pain. Yet, much of the attention was less about history and more about spectacle. Viral videos of his truck riddled with bullets circulated widely, often stripped of context, presented instead as shocking images for consumption. Some platforms leaned into the sensationalism, framing his death as the final chapter of a gangster movie. This commercialization of his life and death sparked criticism. Community leaders and activists questioned why the media continued to glorify figures like Alpo while ignoring the victims of their choices. To them, every candle lit for Alpo was a reminder of families torn apart by his drug empire and the testimonies that sent others to prison. Still, the myth persisted, and perhaps even grew. Because Alpo's story was so dramatic, so filled with extremes, it was easy for audiences to project their own interpretations onto him. To some, he was a hustler who played the game better than most. To others, he was a traitor who embodied betrayal. To younger generations, who learned of him primarily through media portrayals, he became almost a fictional character, a legend of Harlem streets, more archetype than man. This myth-making was not new. Even before his death, Alpo had been immortalized in Paid in Full, where his character, Rico, played by Cameron, was one of the most memorable portrayals of street ambition and betrayal. The film gave his story cinematic weight, and many viewers who hadn't lived through the 1980s first encountered Alpo through that fictionalized lens. After his death, clips from the film resurfaced, with fans debating how accurately Rico captured the real Alpo's personality and choices. Some insisted it was spot on, others argued it softened or exaggerated certain elements. Either way, the movie ensured that Alpo's story was part of popular culture long before his final night in Harlem. What the media frenzy after his death revealed was the ongoing hunger for gangster mythology. Audiences, whether consciously or not, are drawn to stories of rise and fall, of loyalty and betrayal, of glamour and violence. Alpo's life provided all of that in abundance. His death, far from silencing the fascination, amplified it, offering storytellers a natural conclusion that tied his legend into a complete arc. For the media, Alpo was both cautionary tale and entertainment product, a man whose real-life struggles and sins became material for endless retelling. Yet, beneath all the portrayals, debates, and headlines, a quieter truth remained. Alpo Martinez had been a real man, with family, with history, with choices that left permanent marks on Harlem. For every headline, there were people who remembered him as a brother, a son, or a father. For every viral clip, there were families who remembered loved ones lost to his empire. The media rarely lingered on those human details, preferring the broader strokes of myth. But within Harlem, those details mattered, and they complicated the way his story was consumed. Months after his death, as documentaries continued to surface and debates raged online, it became clear that Alpo's legacy would never settle into one simple narrative. He had become a symbol, a cultural reference point, and a subject of fascination that outlived him. Whether as a villain, a legend, or a warning, he remained lodged in the public imagination, proving that the line between reality and myth is often blurred, especially when it comes to figures like Alpo Martinez. Alpo Martinez's death may have brought his story to a close, but his name did not fade with the sound of those final gunshots. Instead, his legacy settled into Harlem, into hip-hop culture, and into the wider consciousness of anyone fascinated by the rise and fall of street legends. Unlike many men who vanish into the shadows of prison or are forgotten after their deaths, Alpo's story persisted. The reason was simple: his life embodied both the dream and the nightmare of the hustle. His name became shorthand for ambition without boundaries, loyalty betrayed, and the price that inevitably comes when choices defy the very codes that once built power. In Harlem, his legacy was particularly complex. On the one hand, there were those who viewed his story as a stern warning. Parents told their children about Alpo not to inspire them, but to warn them of how far, and how fast, the streets could take you down. They reminded the younger generation that the flash, the cars, the jewelry, and the fast money never came without consequences. Alpo's name was often mentioned alongside Rich Porter's and Azie Faison's when recounting the 1980s, but where Rich was seen as the tragic victim and Azie as the survivor turned cautionary storyteller, Alpo became the emblem of betrayal and downfall. On the other hand, there were still voices that spoke of his charm, his charisma, and the magnetic force that had made him stand out even in a city full of hustlers. For these individuals, Alpo symbolized Harlem's boldness, its willingness to dream big even in the face of poverty and systemic neglect. They acknowledged his flaws, but they also recognized how he had captivated an era, how he had left an imprint that could not simply be erased by death or judgment. This duality meant that Harlem remembered him with a mix of resentment and reluctant admiration. Hip-hop, with its deep ties to the streets, carried his name forward in its own way. Artists referenced him in lyrics, sometimes condemning him as a snitch, other times evoking his rise as a metaphor for street ambition. To call someone an Alpo became a cultural shorthand, an insult in most contexts, signaling betrayal, but also a reminder of the scale of power he once commanded. His story fit neatly into the archetypes that hip-hop so often explores: the hustler, the traitor, the fallen king. Songs and interviews kept his name alive, ensuring that younger listeners who never lived through the crack era still knew who Alpo Martinez was. Beyond Harlem and hip-hop, Alpo's name became embedded in the broader underworld lexicon. Prison conversations, barbershop debates, and corner talk often circled back to his story. For those still living by the street code, Alpo was the textbook example of why betrayal cannot be forgiven. His life became a case study, his choices dissected as both a lesson and a warning. Even years after his death, the mention of his name in such circles sparked emotion, anger for the lives he had taken and betrayed, but also fascination for the audacity of his survival. The media's role in shaping his long-term legacy cannot be overlooked. With the resurgence of interest after his death, his story became immortalized through documentaries, podcasts, and endless online commentary. In this retelling, Alpo became more myth than man. His complexities, his humanity, his contradictions, were often simplified into archetypes: the hustler who betrayed, the kingpin who fell, the man who could not escape the streets. This myth-making ensured that his story would be passed down not only as fact, but also as legend, with each retelling bending slightly depending on who told it and why. Yet, beneath the myth, there was always the question of what his legacy truly meant. Was Alpo remembered because of the wealth he amassed, the betrayals he committed, or the violent end that seemed to fulfill the prophecy of his life? Or was he remembered because his story forced Harlem, and America more broadly, to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty, ambition, loyalty, and survival? For many, it was a mix of both. He was not simply a villain or a hero, he was both cautionary tale and cultural symbol, embodying the contradictions of a world that raised him and destroyed him. Generationally, his name carried different weight. For those who lived through the 1980s, Alpo was a vivid memory, tied to personal experiences of loss, fear, or fascination. For the younger generation, who knew him mainly through paid-in-full or YouTube documentaries, he was a character, almost fictional, whose story existed more as entertainment than lived reality. This generational gap only deepened the complexity of his legacy, turning him into both a lesson for the old and a myth for the young. Even in death, Alpo's presence lingered in Harlem's physical spaces. The corner where his truck was riddled with bullets became part of local lore. Old-timers pointed to it when telling stories, reminding the young of what had happened there. His funeral, his memorials, and the debates that followed left behind a residue of memory that kept his name alive long after the candles had burned out. Harlem, a place that never forgets, ensured that Alpo Martinez remained part of its narrative, both as a caution and as a legend. Ultimately, Alpo's long-term legacy was that of a paradox. He was both the Harlem hustler who embodied ambition and style, and the man whose betrayal stained his reputation forever. He was both admired for his rise and condemned for his fall. He was both remembered as a man who lived boldly and dismissed as one who died predictably. This paradox was what kept people talking, kept his story alive, and ensured that even in death, Alpo Martinez remained larger than life. What made his legacy endure was not that he had been perfect, far from it. It was that his story contained everything the streets recognize as real: hunger, loyalty, betrayal, survival, violence, and downfall. Few lives encapsulate so many contradictions, and few names carry such weight in both admiration and disdain. That is why, years after his death, Alpo's story still echoes through Harlem's avenues, through hip-hop lyrics, and through the whispered lessons passed from one generation to the next. The life and death of Alpo Martinez did more than captivate Harlem's imagination. It left behind lessons, each one written in the ink of ambition, betrayal, and consequence. These lessons, while drawn from one man's story, echo far beyond his own choices. They serve as warnings, reminders, and reflections for anyone trying to understand the codes of the street, the fragility of loyalty, and the inevitable price that comes with breaking the unspoken rules of survival. Perhaps the most obvious lesson lies in the matter of loyalty. In the underworld, loyalty is not merely a virtue, it is the currency on which everything else depends. Money can buy cars, jewelry, and even short-term respect, but it cannot buy trust. Alpo's betrayal of Rich Porter, his closest friend, his brother-in-arms, remains one of the darkest stains on his legacy. For many, it was proof that no matter how close two hustlers become, ambition and paranoia can corrode even the strongest bonds. This betrayal reshaped how Harlem viewed loyalty itself. It showed that loyalty built on fast money and shared crimes was fragile, and when tested by greed or fear, it could crumble overnight. Another enduring lesson is that betrayal never fades. When Alpo cooperated with law enforcement to save his own life, he may have extended his time on earth, but he signed away something far more permanent: his reputation. In the streets, reputation is everything. It is the shield that keeps enemies at bay and the glue that holds alliances together. By testifying against his associates, Alpo not only saved himself temporarily but also condemned himself to a lifetime of mistrust. His very name became synonymous with snitch. This reality speaks to a larger truth: decisions made in moments of desperation can carry consequences that last longer than life itself. The cost of the hustle itself also forms a critical lesson. The streets can be intoxicating, offering wealth and recognition to young men who otherwise feel invisible. Alpo's rise reflected this allure, from a young hustler with charm and hunger to a kingpin who commanded attention across Harlem. Yet his story reminds us that the hustle is never free. Every car, every party, every diamond chain came at the cost of sleepless nights, paranoia, and violence. For Alpo, the price was heavier still: friendships lost, respect destroyed, and, in the end, his life taken on the very streets that once applauded him. There is also the lesson of inevitability. Many who watched Alpo's story unfold believed that his end was written long before those gunshots rang out in Harlem. The streets have a rhythm, a cycle that punishes those who rise too fast, betray too many, or outlive their usefulness. Alpo's choices only accelerated what was already expected: the inevitability of downfall. This lesson resonates deeply because it challenges the fantasy of escape. For every hustler who dreams of getting rich and disappearing into comfort, Alpo's fate is a reminder that the past rarely lets go. Choices made in youth, in moments of greed, or in acts of betrayal have a way of circling back, demanding their due. For Harlem, his life offered a moral lesson for the next generation. Parents, older siblings, and community leaders pointed to Alpo's story as an example of what not to do. They told children that flashy cars and designer clothes could not cover the weight of guilt or the certainty of consequence. Teachers, mentors, and survivors of the crack era invoked his name as a way to show that the glamour of fast money is always temporary. In this sense, Alpo became an unintended teacher, a cautionary figure whose mistakes provided lessons for others. His story also highlights the tension between survival and morality. Many questioned whether Alpo's cooperation with law enforcement was betrayal or simply a man's desperate attempt to survive. This gray area invites uncomfortable questions. What would you do if faced with decades in prison or a death sentence? Is survival at any cost justifiable? Or is loyalty to a code more valuable than life itself? Alpo's decision forced Harlem, and indeed anyone who studied his story, to wrestle with these questions. The lesson here is less about judgment and more about understanding the costs of choices in environments where survival is never guaranteed. Another lesson comes from the way his life was mythologized. Despite the betrayals, the murders, and the cooperation with authorities, Alpo remained a subject of fascination. His name carried weight in music, media, and conversation. This speaks to a deeper human tendency, the allure of dangerous legends. People are drawn to stories of men who lived on the edge, even when those stories end in tragedy. The lesson, then, is not only about Alpo himself but about society's appetite for narratives of rise and fall. It forces us to ask why we glamorize these figures, why we repeat their names, and what it says about our collective hunger for cautionary tales dressed as legends. Finally, his story teaches that the streets themselves do not forgive. No matter how much time passes, no matter how far one runs, debts remain unpaid until they are collected. For Alpo, his choices caught up with him long after he may have thought he was free. He had returned to Harlem, perhaps believing that time had dulled old resentments. But the streets remember. The lesson is clear: in that world, there is no true retirement, no permanent escape, only the slow countdown until consequences arrive. Together, these lessons form the enduring legacy of Alpo Martinez. His life is a mirror held up to the streets, reflecting the truths that many would prefer to ignore: that loyalty is fragile, betrayal is unforgettable, survival often comes at unbearable cost, and that the hustle always demands payment in the end. His story continues to be told not because it was glamorous, but because it was real, raw, and filled with lessons that generations can learn from. As the story of Alpo Martinez reaches its end, what lingers is not only the sound of gunshots echoing through Harlem's night or the headlines that followed, but the quiet reflection his life invites. Every life, no matter how tangled, leaves behind threads for others to examine. For Alpo, those threads are woven from ambition, betrayal, survival, and consequence. His journey, from a boy with restless energy in East Harlem to a man whose name became etched into both legend and infamy, holds within it the contradictions of human desire and the unyielding law of the streets. In the stillness of reflection, one cannot help but return to the image of Harlem itself, the neon lights, the hum of traffic, the rhythm of a neighborhood that raised so many dreamers and so many hustlers. Alpo was both a product of this world and a symbol of it. The same streets that nurtured his charm and his hustle also became the setting of his downfall. It is here that the story feels complete: Harlem gave him life, Harlem shaped his rise, and Harlem, in the end, claimed him back. This circular journey is not just the arc of one man's life, but a reminder of how deeply tied we are to the places that form us. There is also a certain symmetry in how Alpo's story unfolded. His rise was rapid, fueled by charisma, intelligence, and a willingness to take risks others feared. His downfall was equally swift, fueled by betrayal, choices made in desperation, and a code he could no longer uphold. The balance between these two halves makes his story feel almost faded, as though every bright light in his youth cast the shadow that eventually swallowed him. When viewed through this lens, his life becomes less about individual moments and more about the inevitability of cycles: rise, reign, and ruin. Yet to reduce Alpo's life to inevitability would be to strip it of nuance. He was not a character in a play, bound to a script with no agency. He was a man, complex, flawed, and deeply human. He laughed with friends, inspired loyalty in some, and betrayed others. He made choices that elevated him, and choices that destroyed him. To reflect on his life is to recognize the duality within all of us: the capacity for greatness and for failure, for loyalty and for betrayal, for ambition and for regret. His story resonates not just because it was dramatic, but because it mirrors the contradictions we all carry, magnified through the lens of the streets. For those listening to his story now, perhaps while lying in bed, allowing the rhythm of the narrative to wash over them, Alpo's life offers a kind of meditation on consequence. Every action, no matter how small, sets into motion a chain of events. A decision made in a moment of pride, anger, or fear can ripple outward for years, even decades. Alpo's decisions, whether to step into the hustle, whether to betray a friend, whether to cooperate with authorities, each carried ripples that extended far beyond himself. They touched families, communities, and generations. In this way, his life reminds us that no choice exists in isolation. His story also leaves us with the question of legacy. What does it mean to be remembered? For some, Alpo will forever be the hustler who reached dazzling heights, embodying the allure of Harlem in its most electric years. For others, he will always be the betrayer, the man whose name became synonymous with disloyalty. And for many more, his story is a warning, a reminder that the streets demand more than they ever give. Legacy, then, is not a single narrative but a chorus of voices, each telling the story through their own lens. Alpo's legacy is no different, fragmented, debated, and endlessly retold. As with all cautionary tales, the greatest power of Alpo's story lies not in judgment, but in understanding. To dismiss him simply as a villain or glorify him as a legend would be to miss the deeper lessons of his journey. He was both, and neither. His life was shaped by the social and economic forces of his time, by the allure of fast money, by the cracks in the foundation of loyalty, and by the choices he made when faced with impossible odds. To understand him is to understand not just one man, but the larger world of Harlem in the 1980s and the streets that raised him. And so, as we close this story, there is a quiet truth that lingers. The streets will always remember Alpo Martinez, not only for the money he made or the betrayals he committed, but for the story his life tells about the cost of the hustle. His name will be whispered as both legend and warning, his story retold as both myth and lesson. And while he may no longer walk Harlem's avenues, the echoes of his choices still move through them, shaping conversations, inspiring caution, and reminding everyone who listens that the streets never forget. In the end, perhaps the most fitting reflection is this: Alpo's story is not about how one man lived or died, but about what his life means to those who remain. For the dreamers, it is a reminder to tread carefully. For the hustlers, it is a warning of how quickly fortunes can turn. For the betrayed, it is a painful lesson in trust. And for Harlem, it is another chapter in a long history of resilience, tragedy, and memory. His story, told here in the quiet of the night, becomes less about him alone and more about the timeless truths of ambition, loyalty, and consequence. So as you drift deeper into rest, let the story of Alpo Martinez settle not as noise, but as reflection. His life was a mirror of choices, his end a reminder of consequence, and his legacy a whisper that carries forward: rise if you must, but remember that the streets always collect their debts.